Welcome to Sustainability Now, an exploration of technologies and paradigms to shape a world that works. Designed for socially conscious entrepreneurs and individuals interested in responsible stewardship of the planet. Sustainability Now covers food, energy, housing, water, waste, health, economics, and consciousness. Welcome to your community, Sustainability Now, with your host, Mira Rubin.
Welcome, everybody, to Sustainability Now, Technologies and Paradigms to Shape a World that Works. I'm your host, Mira Rubin, and it is my privilege to introduce Zach Weiss, founder of Elemental Ecosystems and Water Stories, an online educational platform created to empower the reviving of landscapes, restoration of water cycles, and inspiring communities to take action for a better common future. After a rigorous 2-year apprenticeship, Zach became the first person ever to earn Holzer practitioner certification directly from revolutionary Austrian farmer Sepp Holzer. Having a decade of experience in the field, Zach has worked in more than 25 countries and 6 continents, spanning a wide range of climates, contexts, landforms, and ecosystems to successfully transform barren terrains into lush and verdant landscapes. Before we get started with Zach, I just want to give a shout out to all of you who have been supporting Sustainability Now. We so appreciate your support and helping us to keep the lights on. So I just want to call out our most recent contributors, Claudia Foster and Connie Keener. We so appreciate you and all of you who are helping to carry the torch. This is something that we all do together, and together we really can make a profound difference. So many appreciations to all of you. And so back to you, Zach. Zach, I am so excited to talk to you. What you are doing with Water Stories and with Elemental Ecosystems is probably the singular most hopeful solution to restoring our planet that I have seen. So I just want to share your genius and your knowledge with everybody, because I really believe that if we follow what you're up to and we implement it, that we can really turn things around in the space of 5 or 10 years. So now that I've teased everybody sufficiently, how about if you tell us about restoring water cycles?
Yeah, thanks so much for that intro. I really appreciate it. I should clarify too that, really in all of this, I'm just the messenger. I'm finding all of these amazing people that have done incredible works throughout their whole lifetimes, and then just trying to help bring these stories to the mainstream, because it is so hopeful. There are so many hopeful solutions out there, whether it's restoring deserts to lush paradises, whether it's reviving rivers, whether it's reducing the temperature, whether it's preventing wildfires from coming into lands. There are clear, proven solutions that many awesome visionary people have been working on for the past 10, 20, 50 years. And so this is what we're really trying to do with Water Stories, is bring this story of reviving the watershed. We all know very clearly that humans can destroy. It's in the news every day. We see it all around us. A lot of us have a lot of fear and anxiety because of this, because we see it every day. But less known are the stories of humans restoring landscapes, of humans taking barren, degraded, destroyed landscapes and turning them back into productive, viable habitats. So that's what we're really trying to spread with Water Stories, is the awareness that as humans, we can certainly destroy, but we can also co-create with nature. We can heal the landscape in this way that is really natural and that actually happens really quickly on a human timescale.
So I have so many questions. So I'm so excited. I'm like stepping all over myself, trying to figure out where to start with you. But maybe we have a lot of focus right now in terms of turning things around with climate change on the carbon cycle. And I want to just address what the distinction is between the effect that we can have by addressing carbon sequestration versus water cycles. And then I'd like to get into what is this and what is this magic that you guys are sharing and doing in the world to make these changes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I really feel more and more as though we, as the modern day environmental movement, have really hitched our cart to the wrong horse, in the sense of we're all fully invested in carbon, which, granted, we have these emission problems, we have very real issues when it comes to carbon. But when you look at the global heat dynamics of the earth and how these climate change models work, if we just parse out the heat dynamics, we know that somewhere between 4 and 20% are driven by all of the carbon cycle, not just CO2, but all of the carbon cycle put together. When we look at our planet, somewhere between 70 and 95% of those heat dynamics are regulated by water. Now, with the first climate models, and still with the climate models to this day, we don't model for water, because water, there's ways that it heats up the climate, there's ways that it cools off. It exists in these 3 different phases. It's way too complicated to model. We don't even understand water well enough to model. So in our climate models, we've set it as a neutral, as something that's a constant we haven't impacted. But then you can look at the state of the world and realize that in just the last 10,000 years, we've desertified 1/3 of all of Earth's lands. So we've drained this huge volume of water, fresh water, from the lands into the oceans. And so to claim that our impact is neutral is just patently false. We have definitely had a decidedly not neutral impact. Now, when we work with carbon, we don't see the results for so long. The ocean has this immense buffering effect. So if we implement all of the solutions today, we won't even know if it's working for 20, 50 years or longer. Whereas when we work with water, we see the results after the first rainy season. We can have a night and day transformation in 3, 5, 10 years, depending on the climate. So you start to work with something that really makes sense on a human life cycle, where we can do something, see our actions, and then do more of it because we have a positive feedback loop. When we're working with carbon, we're really just trying to set things up better for the next generation. So you and I, as the people doing the work, don't actually see any of the benefits from that work. And so I think because of that, we've had a really slow adoption of all of that, because it's all in the future for other people, not immediately for us today. And so that's what I find so powerful about working with water, is the people who are doing the work are immediately rewarded by having more water supplies, by having more agriculture, by reducing flood, drought, and fire on their landscapes, by controlling the temperature. There's all these really positive impacts that we start to feel immediately when we do start working with water.
You have said that human beings, we all know we can do harm. One of the big foundations of what you're doing with water stories is creating good. And what I see about the carbon story is that it's really about reducing harm. It's not about doing good. And that's an important thing to do, to reduce harm, but we do have the capacity to do good. And I think that if we can shift into a paradigm where we recognize that we can have a positive influence on the world, that in itself is transformative, that in itself is enrolling. I don't know too many humans that wouldn't get on board with that.
Exactly. And it's so much easier to be for something than against something. We have all these movements against all of these negative things, which, yes, we need that. But also, as you push against those, they push back. And so sometimes they actually get stronger as a result of our pushing against them. So what we're really trying to do is show what people can be for. What, instead of being what can we be against, we all know what we should be against or could be against. What can we be for as an alternative? And so a way I like to speak about it is, I want to have the largest possible environmental footprint, which surprises people, because when we talk about environmental footprint, it's all about reducing our environmental footprint. But that footprint, as you alluded to, it can be negative or it can be positive. I want to have the largest possible positive environmental footprint I can. And if we're only ever talking about our footprint as being bad or less bad, it's always going to be bad because we've never even moved to the positive. So when we look at offsetting some of these negative things that are happening, we need to have positive footprints on our landscapes.
And I think that we get to look at what does it mean to have a positive footprint, and the generation of life is very much at the core of that, I think, to, and what you're talking about is restoring nature's natural systems. So let's talk a little bit about that. First, maybe if you could explain why these interventions are going to affect things like temperature, like fire, like flood, like drought. How is that the case?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to explain that is to look at the water cycle as a whole. And we all learn about the water cycle in school, but we really only learn about the big water cycle, the primary water cycle, water moving from the ocean onto land and then back again. But there are all these smaller loops within the water cycle that we don't really learn about. We don't really learn that half of our precipitation is from water evaporated or transpired locally from a landscape. So as we start to dry up a landscape, we start to lose portions of that half of our precipitation. Not only that, but then you have all these plants that are consuming that water. They're cooling the air, 590 calories per gram of water they transpire. They're moving that heat energy up higher into the atmosphere, where then as it condenses, it releases that in a waveform that's able to leave the atmosphere very easily. It's not interactive with these greenhouse gases. So we have a living vapor, heat, moisture pump that is working when we have these living systems. We all know that water is life. Life doesn't exist without water. Even if you look at ourselves, yeah, we're 70% water by volume. If we look molecularly, we're more than 99 out of 100 molecules water. So us and all life forms on this planet, the vast majority of it is water. And without water, it doesn't exist. So when we look at what we've done to the water cycle, we've clear cut the lands, we've dredged the rivers for waterways, we've drained the wetlands for farmlands. And so what that's doing is it's short circuiting all of that water. That water is now meeting a hot and hardened earth. So if you imagine like a dry, hot sponge, it doesn't absorb any water at first, it just runs off. We've turned that cool sponge that could absorb that rain into a hard, dry sponge. So all that water is running off, which inevitably creates a flood downstream. We're seeing this massive flooding all around the world. And then because that water didn't infiltrate, we also have a drought later on in the year because we've now starved our land of that water. And then when the drought gets really bad, we have these horrific big mega fires that come through and burn up all the landscape. So because that water isn't entering into the earth, all of that carbon fuel loading that would have been food for fungi, food for the soil, would have helped build up that sponge. It's now just drying out, desiccating into tinder for wildfires. And then we have these mega wildfires come through. So when I get very irritated when I see stories about how flood, drought, or fire are a result of CO2 driven climate change, because that could not be further from the truth. Yes, there's some interactivity there, but the flood, drought, and fire that we're all experiencing, those are directly tied to our management of the landscape, to our mistreatment of the landscape, and designing a landscape that floods and then droughts and burns as a result. So when we start to hold this water in the landscape, we start to protect ourselves from fire. We start to reduce the flood for our neighbors downstream. We prevent our drought later on in that year because we've harvested and stored that water. And then additionally, all the plants using that water are cooling the air an immense amount. So we start to have this positive feedback loop of balance, of productivity, of vitality, of health of the landscape.
I want to direct people to your website because you have some wonderful videos that that illustrate the water cycle, a healthy water cycle, a damaged water cycle. Could you just give us your URL?
Yeah, waterstories.com, and then the videos live within a community on community.waterstories.com. And so, like Mira mentioned, it's free to join. Anyone can join, anyone can watch the videos. And like you said, we've tried to condense this story into these very short animation videos that show the healthy full water cycle, the watershed death spiral, this cycle of flood, drought, and fire that we currently find ourselves in, and then the revived water cycle, how to climb out of that death spiral back into a healthy, fully functioning water cycle.
Beautiful. Well, we've been putting a lot of attention on regenerative agriculture, and certainly that's part of this. But what I see about Water Stories is that it goes into every environment, that it's not just related to the way that we produce our food. And so I know you have stories of success. Before we even get to that, maybe you can talk about, you've alluded to capturing the water, but maybe you can talk about what some of the techniques are that have been so effective in these interventions.
Yeah, for me, it comes down to two core tenets. One is trying to steward water. That means giving places for water, trying to help water be received by the landscape instead of rejected. We've, in so many ways, taken away all the space for water. You look at California has lost 95% of its wetlands over the last couple hundred years. Australia has lost 95% of its wetlands over the last 100 years. So we've stolen all this land from water. We need to start finding ways to give land back to the water, to let it be received, recharged into the ground. And then the other really big...
I just want to interrupt for 1 second, because one of the things that was so powerful in at least one of the videos that I saw that you did is discussing water as the blood of the planet. And that just gives me chills to viscerally experience the truth of that.
Absolutely, it is. And it's one of the easiest ways to understand the water cycle is look at your own body, how your own body is circulating water through it, your own blood. The earth is doing the same thing. And so we can see very clearly how rivers are like veins, returning that water back to the ocean, but it's actually the aerial rivers of water that are the arteries. And these are driven largely by forests, creating these temperature differentials, these pressure differentials, and also producing the nucleates that actually allow that water vapor to form a water droplet, eventually a cloud, and then a rainstorm. So water can't just coalesce on its own. It needs a nuclei to start coalescing around. And one of the main primary nuclei is produced by forests. So it's invisible to see, so it's hard to understand, but these aerial rivers of water vapor moving across the earth are the arteries of this blood system. And if you then look at what we're doing to the earth's circulation, it's catastrophic. We're destroying the forests, which are destroying the nucleates, which are destroying and breaking down these aerial arteries. We're damming up all of the rivers. We're clogging the veins. We're dredging and draining the veins to go down to those big dams and reservoirs. And then when we're running out of water, we're sticking a needle into our arm and pulling out the blood to hydrate the surface. And if you have dehydrated skin, you would never think to stick a needle in your arm and pull out blood to spray all over your skin. That's a recipe for disaster. And we're seeing it all around the world with this over harvesting of groundwater, nothing going back into it. If you think of it like a bank account, the water in the earth is our bank account of life. It's the blood in the earth. If we're always pulling out more than we're putting back, we're going to go broke, and we're going to then fall in this cycle of debt and destruction and scarcity. Whereas if we're always putting a little bit more into the earth than we're taking out, there's always going to be this healthy reservoir to draw upon. So I'm glad you pointed that out. I think that water as the blood of the earth it is the blood of the earth. And this water cycle very much mirrors our own circulation system. And if we think about the things that we're doing to Earth's circulation system, it's no wonder that we're having all of this stress, scarcity, crises, catastrophes. These are all signs of lack of health from our disruption of the circulation.
And so the things that you're doing to restore this, because the fascinating and the most hopeful piece of this is that, yes, in the face of all this devastation, we actually can take action that restores it, that will get the water to replenish itself. And one of the things that we keep hearing about is that we're destined for water wars, that's going to be the next big thing. Well, this mode of interacting with the earth and making a positive impact can make that a non-starter. We don't have to worry about that if we just restore our environment. So I want to get back to how.
Yep. And it's a great point, because it can be confusing to people how I am very against big dams, big reservoirs, but then we're also creating lots of little dams. We're creating lots of little dams all over the landscape. And so the solution to big dams is many little dams, and it's decentralized water retention. So we're not trying to collect all of the water in one big dam or reservoir. We're creating many different places to collect and store the water all throughout the landscape, because that collected and stored water is then feeding the food chain of the ecosystem. It's giving the plants water, it's giving the animals, the insects, everything water to then function off of. So it's very important that these actions are decentralized, that they're spread all throughout. We can't solve these kind of crises with these mega dams, because the mega dams are actually contributing to the crises landscape that leaves the lands in a place where it can't be repaired. And so, or sorry, it can't be worked with viably. And so in the best projects, like one in India, we actually see reverse migration, where the people had fled these dying regions. You bring water back to the region, and the people who had migrated to the cities for work actually come back to their homelands, because they don't want to be in the city working some crappy labor job for no pay to help support their family back home. They want to be back home with their family. And so bringing water to these communities actually caused the reverse migration. And we could do the same thing, whether it's Syria, whether it's Central America, all of these places. We're in this trap right now where we're stuck in water scarcity. We've over allocated all of the water in our waterways. And so oftentimes it's illegal, or you're prevented from holding water up high in the landscape because they need it to make it to that dam that year. And every year these dams are overflowing a ton of water when it's the rainy time, and then they're running out of water later on because they've destroyed the system that would steadily feed water into those dams and reservoirs. Instead of draining all of those landscapes, if we instead created a lot of micro decentralized retention throughout all of it, we'd actually find that the reservoirs would be recharging throughout the dry season. We'd still have some water moving through the system. So we need to get off of this 1 year time horizon that we're always thinking on. How do we have water for this year's drought? And we need to start thinking about the next 10 years, the next 50 years, the next 100 years. We need to start putting more water into the ground so that future generations have water at all. Because if we just keep mainlining water downstream to the cities, we're going to inevitably turn, the whole world into desert.
You said that with this kind of practice where we're creating more water storage areas, I'm surmising that that's the foundation, really, that we can see a turnaround in as little as one rainy season.
Yep.
So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, absolutely. You see the results right away. When it's amazing to come back to projects 1 year later and a dry eroding gully now is a body of water, and you see all the birds coming there every day to drink, and the wildlife, and you see the vegetation all growing around this body of water. And now, because we've pacified that water, there's not the erosion going down the erosion gully anymore either. And it's very important that we're holding water in earthen dams, earthen ponds. We're not using concrete. We're not using plastic liners. When you use a plastic liner, none of that water is going into the earth. So yeah, maybe it creates some habitat, but we're not accomplishing any of this groundwater recharge that we so desperately need. And in some areas, like in India, they're actually even building water bodies where the water will infiltrate as quickly as possible, because they want to get the water into the earth away from the sun so that they can then harvest it later on from these shallow wells that they have. So it is very much about, water is the ultimate capital of life. All life runs off of water. So once you increase the water availability of a place, you have more life as a result. And so I see a lot of projects where they're trying to grow abundant life, but they're not starting by storing the water. And so that water work is 70% of the work. If you do the water work, you're going to have rich, abundant vegetation. Then it's just a matter of what kind of vegetation do you want. And if you don't do the water work up front, you're never going to be able to really have success in your efforts. You're always going to need to baby them along with irrigation. And now we're actually extracting more water from the ground. And so it's very important that we start to look at this and really take a new approach with water, a new relationship with water.
What kind of bridge do you create between the work you're doing and regenerative agriculture?
I think the work we're doing fits, or maybe better to say that regenerative agriculture fits within the work that we're doing. On many of our projects, what we're providing is the turbo boosters to the regenerative agriculture efforts that they have in place. You really need to plant the rain and then plant whatever it is you want to plant on that. So whether it's pasture for animals, whether it's tree systems, whether it's even just annual garden systems, if we don't have that rain planted into the ground, we've stopped our base level. And a lot of times people look at these heavy-handed approaches and think, oh, that's not natural. We're using big equipment, we're using machines, we're doing things of this nature, but we're also in this landscape that has been so altered in many cases by these big machines. So if you come onto a landscape that has had drains put in by excavators, it's been drain tiled, it's been all leveled by a bulldozer, it's really hard to undo that with a shovel. You're working with this thing that has a huge amount of energy to move earth around, and now we're just trying to undo it by hand. So I really view it as our responsibility, while we still have this fossil fuel resource available, to fix a lot of the damage that's been done on our landscape so that future generations aren't left trying to break up these hard surfaces with a pickaxe because they don't have a cheap, freely available energy source to do so with. So it's hard for people to see, but once you start to see it, you see it all over. Anywhere that water is running straight, that is a dredged waterway. Water does not flow straight. Water flows in a meander. It weaves back and forth. And so when you start to realize this, you can see all over the landscape these drainage systems that were put in place. They were put in place when we had a really healthy landscape, when we had rich forests that helped infiltrate the water. Water was just pouring out everywhere. There was too much water. So in order to be able to do agriculture, we had to drain that water away to make arable soils. Now we're seeing the results of that, a couple hundred years later, and seeing that it's actually led us to this spiral of flood, drought, and fire.
You mentioned that a lot of these practices are not legal. And I want to talk about that because, first of all, you have some wonderful success stories, and I'd love you to share that. But also, people have paid the price for some of those successes, and I'd like to hear about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, out of that frustration was born Water Stories, in that it's so insane to me that the people who are spending their time, their hard-earned money, their energy on making the world a better place, we're also requiring them to become to break the law in order to do those things. So a lot of this stems from the water rights system or water law, where essentially water is owned and to be distributed by the states. And so, for example,
Well, I just want to put a pin in that because I think that a lot of people aren't aware of that. Maybe
yeah,
you can elaborate on that a bit.
yeah. So, for example, the one that I know really well is Montana state law. And the way it's written is any water in the sky, on the ground, or in the ground is owned by the state of Montana to be distributed by the state of Montana, which basically means, the way the water rights system is, the older your right is, the more right you have to it. So whatever colonizer first came to that area and killed all the indigenous people, their descendants are now the water barons who own that water, who can do whatever they want to with that water because their ancestors killed the previous ancestors of the landscape and claimed the water. But now you have this situation where if you don't have a water right, just forget it. You can't do any of this. And we're in this system where, look at the Colorado River. We can't do decentralized retention to revive the Colorado River because they want all of that water going into the river, going downstream to LA and the other areas that it services. So they might have a 1 year shortage if we did really massive decentralized retention, but then they would have more surplus every year after that point. And it could also be done in a slow incremental way where it causes no interruption in service, doesn't really cause a meaningful deficit that first year. But this is not good for the people who own the water, because in a water abundant world, water is valueless. In a water scarce world, water is the most valuable thing. So as places privatize their water, we get into this situation where the people who are now in control of that water is some wanker banker who has no connection to that landscape, who has no ramifications for their decisions, and they're making their decisions off of a spreadsheet. How can we make the most money? Not how can we make a healthy landscape? How can we make sure everyone has access to water? So you look at a situation like in 2020 in Australia, a place that has privatized their water supply. You had a situation where indigenous communities hadn't had their rivers flow for 3 years. 3 years they've been trucking in water, and the people who owned the water were wasting it to artificially inflate the price even higher so they could make even higher profits. In the way that the water rights system is set up, if you don't use it, you lose it. So these people who own the water, they have to use their allotment every year in order to keep their allotment. And so if they don't even need it, they keep using it because otherwise they lose it. And so it's just this totally insane system. You look at someone like Rajendra, his work in India that I mentioned.
Rajendra Singh.
Yep.
So maybe you can provide resources for folks to look into him more thoroughly.
Yeah, Rajendra Singh Tarun Bharat Song is his organization. That would be the best website to check out. And then this,
Could you spell that for a sec?
I can,
If
let me
not,
just pull it
that's
up so I
okay.
make sure I don't. Yeah,
We'll put links on our website. It's okay.
Yeah, but if you look up Rajendra Singh, Ragendra, last name Singh, that's, you'll find him. He's called the Waterman of India, and he started this movement of community-driven, decentralized water management. So they started building these small earthen ponds, essentially. They call them johads, which was the traditional management system for water in India before colonization came and brought piped water to everyone and people stopped tending the traditional structures. So what they've done is they've revived these traditional water management structures. Communities, they've created, several thousand johads throughout this region at this point. It has brought water back to 250,000 wells that were dry, now have water again. This has impacted over 1 million people, causing the reverse migration It's lowered the temperature 2 degrees Celsius in this region, and it has revived 7 rivers to perennial flow. 7 rivers that had gone dry, at least seasonally, some of which were dry for decades, now have perennial flow. Because they're in the driest part of India, where they get these big monsoon rains and then a long dry season. And so if that water just leaves, you're dust later on in the year. But what they did is they held the water in the landscape, they returned the water to the landscape, and this caused this whole ripple chain of effects. Now, back to your question, he had 72 legal cases against him by the government. He was under house arrest at one point. The government has made his work very difficult because it's costing them money, because these people that were dependent on other water now have their own water, because the water that would have rushed down into their big hydro dams, not quite as much as making it there now. Over time, it's just as much making it, but basically because the way the water laws are, if you impound water upstream from where it's owned, you're doing something that's illegal. And not just that, the government then sold the fishing rights to the water bodies that the communities had made to other people, which then the communities banded together and said, no, it's actually you who needs permission from us to fish these areas because this is water that we created. And so it kind of goes to that no good deed goes unpunished. You look at Sepp Holzer in Austria. He created this incredible Garden of Eden farm on a mountainside that was thought to be useless land only for forestry or a little bit of grain. He created 72 interconnected ponds and water bodies. There's just life everywhere on that landscape: crawfish, fish, all sorts of tree crops, animals. And he's one of the most fined farmers in Europe. He was fined for creating terraces. He was fined for creating water bodies. He was fined for planting fruit trees, because in Austria, they have the system where you're only supposed to grow certain things in certain regions. And so he had this immense fight and struggle his whole life to do what nature was telling him to do. And, I'm really grateful for these people that stood up to these atrocities and said, we're not going to listen to the laws of man. We're following the laws of nature. We're doing what's right for our landscape. And they oftentimes do end up coming out on top, but only after a lot of turmoil and strife. Another example, Peter Marshall in Australia has been fined almost $1 million for planting willows because they're an invasive species. Now, when the fires came through, it burned around his property for 2 months. All of his neighbors' ashes burned. The fire came in from every direction, yet his property didn't burn. Why? Because he had retained the water, because he had planted fire retardant species like willows, because he had tended his forests in a way that enabled him to take crown fires to ground fires. But yet he was heavily fined throughout his whole course of doing this. So we really need to, I think the only way out of this mess is to have our own shock doctrine, where we have the policy written to change things. And as these crisis events happen, we bring those policy pieces forward. So the Boulder fire comes through and burns up everyone's home. We have the policy already written to say, hey, if we want to prevent this next time, we need to allow people to store water on their land. Every raindrop that falls on their land can be stored on that land if they choose to. And that's the time when we're going to have enough public interest and pressure to actually push legislation like that through.
So many questions. Okay, so do you actually have that policy document written?
No, it's something that we hope will be birthed out of Water Stories.
Okay.
It's going to be different policy pieces.
This is a place where people can become engaged and involved. You could use some good attorneys to be crafting those kinds of policy documents.
Exactly. And I would love to build on, there's this beautiful movement, the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, which is spearheading some of this work. They're doing a really good job as far as preventing chemical trespassing and things of that nature. But we also need some legislation that just allows people to steward their own land and their own water. And in many states, this legislation already exists. It's just not used a lot. So there's kind of a two-pronged approach. We need to write new legislation that makes it clear that people can do this, and we need people to break the laws openly and willingly, back to the letter from Birmingham jail, and then use some of these hidden laws within state statutes that say if you're doing something that's reducing erosion, you're allowed to do it without permits, for example.
Wow.
So we need to start activating some pieces of law that aren't very activated right now, and we also need to draft and implement some new policy to open up some more clear pathways. Because you look at a place like California, my least favorite place in the world to work because it's impossible. We did one project there where it saved the house twice. Once from the fires when they came through, the property didn't burn. Then with it being chaparral, the landslides when the rain came through, the water body we had built caught the landslide before it took out the house. So we saved the house and the property twice. Everything we did is illegal. We can't talk about that project. We can't say where it is. So in California, you're in this urgent crisis situation, yet all of our pathways to fix it are illegal. So we need to fix that. We need to fix it urgently.
Well, so let's make a call to people who have the will and the knowledge to be starting to draft new policies. I mean, this goes back to something about that you were talking about earlier. Just the privatization of water is an insane concept. It is the emperor has no clothes, that water, first of all, can be owned. And second of all, that people can be prosecuted for violating a state's right or independent individual's right, and that all this water is being, it's the height of insanity. Truly, truly, it's boggling to me. Absolutely boggling.
It really is. In my opinion, the privatization of water is criminal and it should be prosecuted as criminal. The people doing it should be put in jail, should be locked away. And you look at, again, California, there's a great film, Power and Water, A California Heist, where the state of California privatized a public utility for the Resnicks, the most wealthy farmers in California. They put, I think, $4 to $6 million in basically taking parts of the Sacramento River and pumping it into groundwater reservoirs in a totally dry part of California, that they then, in these backdoors, shady deals, without any public comment, without any public discourse, handed this whole system over to a shell corporation owned mostly by the Resnicks, the wonderful pomegranate and almond and pistachio farmers. And so, it's just, it opens itself up to so much corruption, so many issues. And like they see now in California, where the people working on those farms have contaminated water, need to bring in bottled water, yet the multi-millionaire farmers were given this huge water supply that they don't even let their own farmers access. So it's just sheer insanity, and it's something that is only going to be stopped by we, the people, coming together and saying, this is insane. We will not stand for this. Water is a basic human right. And it's not just a human right, it's a life right. It's a right to the trees, to the fish, to the animals, to all of our co-living beings on this planet. And that's one thing that the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature is starting to do. And it's really gaining steam in that I think their first court case was in 2008. And now it's like every year, several nations are adding constitutional amendments that make water a right to their people, because it just makes so much sense. Of course, water is a basic human right. Without it for 3 days, we're all dead. So it's insane to me that we've created this system where the people who already have so much wealth are basically gifted the water supplies or sold them for very cheap. Nestle pays, I think it's like $500 a year for all of their claims in Florida, where they're just extracting all the groundwater, paying basically nothing for it, making money hand over fist. And the CEO of Nestle actually came out and said that water is not a human right. It should not be a human right, and it
It's a
is not.
Nestle right.
Exactly. And so we're in this situation where I think the only way out is community awareness and community action.
Well,
And
I think the biggest impediment is the fact that people just have no clue. I mean, when you're speaking this, when people hear this, when I've communicated some of these things to people, their jaws drop. Like, what do you mean? What do you mean we don't have right to water? What do you mean that it can be owned? What do you mean that people can be fined for collecting water when it rains? It's obscene.
it
And
really is. Yeah.
yeah, and I think that this is something that we often take action toward, and this is the next phase of my questions for you. What kinds of actions can we take, and how can we learn more? I want to just say that you're going to be doing a course,
Yep.
and I'm excited beyond measure about that. Maybe you can say a little bit about that, and then what kind of action coalition can we put together to support this movement?
Yeah. So our goal at Water Stories is to basically make thousands, if not millions of people like myself that are, their profession is restoring water. Their profession is helping others bring water back to their landscape. I see there is so much interest in my services, so much more than I can possibly service. And like you said, most people don't even know that this is possible. They don't even know that they should be interested in it. And whether I'm, talking to a taxi driver or the person sitting next to me on the bus, when they hear about this, people just catch fire with it because it's something really practical, pragmatic that we all can do. Um, and so that's what our course is really aimed at, training people how to read the landscape, how to understand the water cycle, how to create interventions to enhance and repair the water cycle, how to build skills and find mentors, how to do community outreach, and how to start working on some of these policy barriers, and then also how to make a vocation a livelihood where you're earning your living doing these things, so that we're not in this situation where people work some job that they hate to then in their few bit of off hours do something that they find fulfillment in. We want to create it where more people, like I just am so grateful and appreciative that every day I do exactly what I feel is most important, and that supports me in having my own life, that feeds me, that gives me everything I need. And so it's just so fulfilling to have my 9 to 5 job, or if you're insane like me, 6 to 9 job, be everything that I want to be doing. I would be doing this if I wasn't getting paid a penny for it, because it's what I believe in. And so this course, we really hope to train up a whole generation of practitioners, a generation of people with the skills of a Rajendra Singh or a Sepp Holzer or myself that really know how to do these things. So our course will start June 1. There'll actually just be,
2022.
yep,
We have to say what year, because who knows when people will be finding this.
true. Yes, June 1, 2022. We'll actually have 2 periods where you're able to buy into the course. Otherwise, it'll be a closed course. So the last 2 weeks of May will be our main launch. The reason that we're doing this is we want to start a group all together. So that, because the way that our course is structured, there's lots of actions, there's lots of activities, lots of things that you need to do on the ground. It's an online course, but it's really an at-home course in the sense of the learning is going to happen through these activities. And we want people engaging and learning from one another and saying, here, I created this rain garden. Here's the challenges I had. Did anyone find a way to fix this issue, so that we can all share and grow and build this movement together. As far as the,
Let me just ask you, for people that don't have a plot of land, for people that are city dwellers, for instance, is the course something that would be beneficial for them to take?
absolutely. One, from understanding how water is moving through your city or your environment. But two, there's a very important piece that all of the governments of the world are in cities. So as a city dweller, you have an unusual access to governance, to policy, so that we really hope a lot of the people who are in cities who take this course will become active on a policy level, will start being a voice for water, going to the town hall, going to the different public hearings and saying, what results is this decision going to have on our waterways? How are you guys thinking about how all of the water we're draining away from the city, how can we find ways for that to enter the earth? And so in a place like Fullerton, California, in Orange County in the 70s, they actually created a system where all of their drains from the city, all of the surface runoff, actually feed into these water bodies that then infiltrate back into the earth. So they have very little runoff into the sea because they're actually finding ways to infiltrate that. We need every city to do that. And then also, especially for people that dive deeper into the animations that we have, with cities, we get these high pressure heat domes that actually prevent the inflow of cool, moist air. So if you look at California, having built up cities all along California is actually breaking the biotic pump that brings water to the whole desert Southwest. So the desert throughout the American West, has a lot to do with what has happened in California and along the Western coast. So as we start to break up these heat islands, as we introduce trees and vegetation into these spaces, we can start to cool them. As we introduce water bodies into these spaces, we can start to cool them. So whether you're in a city in a high rise with no real access to land, or on a rural landscape where you have abundant access to land, this course gives us all clear things that we can do to really push the needle forward.
So what's echoing in my mind is that a lot of the things that are necessary to make these transformations are currently illegal. So it's like environmental criminals here, or what are we doing? What are we doing?
Yeah, and then the scale also really matters. The pieces that are illegal are the big pieces that create a really big change. So it's really important to fix those, but there's a scale that we all can work at that stays below the threshold of the law. For example, if you're in a place where you can't harvest any rainwater, but you have the water coming off of the roof of your home, if that, instead of going down the gutter directly into the drain, feeds into a rain garden, they're not going to actually enforce that. That's such a small action that it doesn't register on their radar. Similarly, vegetating landscapes, there's no laws against that. And that's something that we can very clearly do to help prepare the water cycle. So there are a whole suite of actions that we can do that aren't illegal or that are under the threshold of interest for the legal bodies. Then another piece is it's all complaint driven. So if you don't get any complaints on what you're doing, you can do whatever you want, essentially. If one of your neighbors, someone is complaining about what you're doing, then you really need to be following the letter of the law. So I think the best place for people to start is to go outside when it's raining. Get on a nice jacket, get on a coat, whatever you need to stay warm, and go and look at what's happening in your landscape when it's raining. Is that rain being rejected by the earth? Are all the hard surfaces feeding that downstream, creating flooding somewhere further downstream and also drought? Or is it actually able to be received by the land? Is it soaking up every raindrop? And so by observing, by watching what happens during a rainstorm, we can immediately get some ideas as far as ways that we can help the land receive that rainfall instead of reject it.
Wonderful. Wonderful. So I guess I would just want to ask you, is there anything I should have asked that I didn't ask?
I think one piece that would just be worthwhile, it can be hard for people to understand how we got here. And I think this speaks to the old versus the new water paradigm. And in the old water paradigm, the reality was when humans were starting to spread around the world, there was an abundance of water in almost all of these places. So water shortage was not even on the radar. And as civilization started to build up and concentration started to build up of humans, and everyone was just defecating in the streets and letting the rain wash it down, pooling water meant disease, meant death, meant issues. And so it started, early on in civilization, as we develop areas, we need to drain all of the water away as quickly as possible to prevent those disease considerations. Now we handle our waste in a much more sanitary way that is no longer needed at all. There is no disease pressure considerations with pooling water anymore. Yet we're still in this idea of drain it all away. Whenever we build a home, we put in drain tile, we put in French drains, the home itself creates runoff. Whenever we put in a road, we're draining all the water away downstream. So we need to start to find ways to adopt the new water paradigm, where anytime we're creating drainage, we're also creating retention to help offset that drainage. And we really need to start moving towards more retention than drainage, in any spots where we can hold water, any forgotten lands, barren lands. I often think how even just the transportation department, if the Department of Transportation became the Department of Transportation and Water Retention, we could have a huge impact very quickly. They have all the equipment, they have all the rights to the land. If every road rebuilding project, you had to also create a water body that caught the water coming off of that road and fed it into the earth, that could have an immense positive impact for a very small budget increase. And when you look at the type of money we're spending on flood, on drought, on fire, it starts to become cheaper, way cheaper, to just put a little bit more effort and energy up front than deal with these crises on the other end of the scenario.
Think of the national parks, even, or state parks, that if we were able to implement some of this in the park systems, that would make a huge difference as well.
Yeah. And so much of it comes back to this idea that humans can only do bad. And so we have this whole conservation movement that's all centered around just don't let humans touch that. We need to move beyond conservation, and instead of looking at this forest that it's been clear cut twice, it's been dredged and drained by the loggers so that they could pull all the logs out, and then it regrew as a forest. That's still not anything approaching what it used to be. And so if our only approach is to say, okay, that's not so destroyed right now, so nobody touch it, we're only ever getting to various degrades of worse and worse in terms of our water cycle. So we need to move past conservation and start to look at these wild lands and say, how can we make them as healthy as possible? How can we help offset the cities by making the conserved areas even more productive than they were before, potentially? Not trying to just hold things as they are, but actually move them actively in a positive direction.
Brings to mind a conversation that we had earlier about marshlands and the craziness around that. So maybe you could just explain that, because we put in place laws being well-meaning, but they're very misdirected in many cases.
Yes, that's a great point that I should have brought up, and I'm glad you reminded me, is that all of these laws are well-intentioned. It's not like any of these lawmakers said, I don't want people to be able to restore their land, so we're going to create an act that doesn't allow them to touch the wetlands. It's because of the destruction of all of these wetlands, because every developer on the face of the earth has drained the wetlands to develop them. We put in place these policies that basically say you can't touch the wetlands, you can't touch them, period. Now that also prevents people from enhancing the wetlands. So now we're in this situation where even if a field has been drain tiled, it's been farmed 50 times, or it's been just totally flogged, really raped, for lack of a better word, because it fits the classification of wetlands, you can't actually create a water body there because it's wetlands. So even though it's heavily degraded, it's this hands-off approach. And so this is where this policy change is really needed. I'm not saying we should get rid of these laws. We need to make allotments in these laws that allow people to do regeneration, that allow people to do restoration, that open up the hands-off, no one can touch period, and open some pathways for, if you want to enhance this wetland, you actually have a way to do it.
So I'm wondering if you have any reference books, specific videos. I know that Water Stories is a phenomenal resource, and community.waterstories.com
Yep.
is that for
Yep.
other videos, but are there any books that you might recommend or any other kinds of resources?
Yes, definitely. I think the videos on the community is really the first place I'd recommend people, but then as they want to dig deeper, a couple of really great resources. One is the New Water Paradigm, Water Systems for the Recovery of Climate. This is a big scientific publication. I think it's like 80, 90 pages long, written by McCall Kravchuk and a whole series of people all around these drainage systems that humans have put in place and how that's causing all of these issues and how we can reverse it. He actually makes a very good case. He actually does the calculations for how many, I think it's 670 cubic kilometers of water that's drained, fresh water drained off of the landscape every year. Every year, we're draining that much fresh water off of the lands. And that's actually resulting in, just that volume of water is resulting in sea level rise of 1 to 2 millimeters per year. So it's such a huge amount of water we're draining out of these systems. It's actually contributing to sea level rise as well. So that's a really great resource for people who want to get more into the scientific ends of the new water paradigm. Another resource that I'd say is going to be better for practitioners, people wanting to enact these things, would be two of Sepp Holzer's books. I would start with Desert or Paradise, his most recent book, and then Sepp Holzer's Permaculture is also a good book for people on a little bit smaller scale. So if you're working on bigger scale or you want to get a good picture of the whole, Desert or Paradise is a really good book for people to learn more about this. And if you're on a suburban scale, backyard gardening scale, and want to learn the practical things you can do in your own backyard, Sepp Holzer's Permaculture is going to be a really good book and reference. There are more, but those would be the places I'd send people to start.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And just one last plug for your course that people, you want to be checking it out to register at the end of May. Where are they going to register? On waterstories.org.com?
Yep, waterstories.com or the community.waterstories.com. We right now are in this sequence of releases where every week we're releasing a new video or have a new event. So people who are interested in the course, I would implore you to join the community. You'll get a really good taste for what the course is going to offer before it's available. But then people will be able to join the course on either of those. They're really two parts of the same website. One is the public facing, and then one is a private community for people who choose to join.
Perfect. Thank you so much for being with us, and thank you so much for the work you're doing.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me. Thanks for the work you're doing, and thanks for bringing me onto this platform to help spread the word. It's time to get this out there, and so I'm really grateful for all the people like yourself who are helping turn the shine on to these different stories.
Well, I really do think it is the most hopeful thing that I've seen, and I think that there's an action that everybody can take in this context, and I love the shift of paradigm to from being a plague on the planet to being a true steward and partnership. And actually, paradigm-wise, the difference is that the carbon sequestration and so many of these other things that we do is seeing us as separate. And this brings us back into being indigenous members of the community of nature. And it's such a shift. It's so profound.
And that, what you just touched on, I think that's one of the most important pieces of all of this. We're in this illusion of separatism, that I am me and you are you, and what I do doesn't affect you and vice versa. But that has never been the case. It's still today not the case. We are all interconnected. We are all part of the same living organism that is Earth. And when we start to see those connections, we start to decide very differently. We start to act really differently. And just to echo what you said, my favorite thing about all of this is it takes people from concerned but really disempowered and not really knowing, we can all get electric vehicles, but that's going to make a tiny difference if the big businesses are still polluting a ton. Whereas this is very empowering. This is something we all can do, makes an immediate difference for ourselves, for our family, for our neighborhood. And as we all start to do it together, it can make the single biggest difference for our coming climate crisis.
100%. 100%. Well, thank you so much. And I'm on board.
Awesome.
Anybody I can tell.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having me here.
Such a pleasure. And I want to say thank you to all of you who are carrying the torch. We all get to shine light on this. We do get to make a difference. And I want to say thank you also to Scott Billy, who is my partner in crime here with Sustainability Now and the producer for these videos and recordings. And that's it for today. Live your best life. Love the world around you, and together we can save the world.
Thank you for listening to Sustainability Now. Visit sustainabilitynow.global to find resources related to today's program. While you're there, pledge your support by making a contribution to help us shape a world that works. And remember to subscribe, share, and follow us on social media.